We interrupt whatever you are doing, chosen one, because there's breaking news, and it's about you. In the last few hours, a story has been developing that nobody saw coming, except you. Your identity, the real one, the full one, the one people spent years trying to summarize in a single lazy sentence, has surfaced. And the reaction is exactly what you'd expect when a story this big breaks without warning. Confusion. Denial. A wave of people suddenly scrambling to figure out how they missed it. This broadcast is going to walk you through every update as it comes in, live, from every corner of the timeline. Before we go to our first report, if you're watching this because you already know deep down that this is your story unfolding, comment breaking right now so we know you're following along. And hit subscribe, because updates like this don't stay quiet for long. Let's go to our first report. This just in. Multiple sources close to the situation are now confirming what insiders always suspected but never said out loud. The long stretches of silence people mocked for years were never a sign of nothing happening. They were the opposite. Our correspondents have reviewed the timeline extensively, and here's what the record actually shows. Every quiet stretch coincided with a period of significant, unreported growth. While the public narrative painted the silence as absence, ambition, or fear, the private reality was control. Deliberate, disciplined control, the kind that doesn't explain itself because it doesn't need an audience's permission to keep operating. Analysts are calling this one of the most misread periods in the entire story. People assumed silence meant surrender. It never did. It meant something was being built where no one thought to look. And now, with the story breaking wide open, the people who spent that silence writing you off are being forced to explain, live, on the record, why they mistook preparation for absence. One thing our sources keep repeating is this. Silence only looks empty to people who've never had anything worth protecting in the first place. If you'd never guarded anything valuable, you wouldn't understand why someone else would. That's the update. That's the correction to the record. And it's only the first one tonight. Something else worth noting before we move to our next report. The cost of that silence was never small. Every day you didn't explain yourself, didn't defend your choices, didn't hand over an easy narrative for people to consume, you paid for it in patience. It would have been easier, at almost any point, to just tell everyone what was actually happening. You didn't, because you understood something the loudest voices in the room never did. Once you explain yourself to people who've already decided not to believe you, you don't gain credibility. You just give them new material to twist. So the silence held, the cost got paid quietly, and tonight's broadcast is the first place that investment is finally being reported accurately. Our newsroom will add one more piece of context before moving on. Several sources describe this period of silence as the most productive stretch in the entire timeline, even though almost nothing about it was visible from the outside. That's not a contradiction. Productivity and visibility are not the same measurement, and confusing the two is exactly how the original, inaccurate reporting on this story got started in the first place. We're getting new details in a story that's been circulating for a while now, the persistent claim that you were somehow behind, somehow late, somehow arriving after your moment had already passed. Our team has gone back through the archive, and the timeline tells a completely different story than the one that was being repeated. What looked like delay from the outside was, according to every available record, precision. There is a meaningful difference between someone who is late because they weren't ready and someone who simply refused to move before the moment actually called for it. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the second explanation. Think about how this plays out in real time. The people who moved fastest, who reacted to every trend and every deadline other people set for them, are the ones whose momentum has already faded from public interest. Meanwhile, this particular story, yours, has only gained weight the longer it waited to surface. That's not something that happens by accident. Timing this precise usually only happens when someone understood the stakes long before anyone else in the room did. Sources close to the story describe it as a masterclass in patience under pressure. Not the passive kind of patience that just waits for something to happen, but the active kind, the kind that keeps building quietly while everyone else assumes nothing is happening at all. That distinction matters because it's the difference between someone who got lucky with timing and someone who engineered it. And here's an update our newsroom just received. Several of the earliest critics, the ones who called this timeline slow, are now declining to comment on record. That silence, ironically, tells its own story. When people who were confident enough to criticize your pace out loud suddenly have nothing to say once the results are in, that's not humility. That's an inability to explain how badly they misjudged the situation, and most people don't like doing that on camera. Our production team also flagged something worth reporting before we move to the next story. Several outlets originally covering this timeline used words like stalled and delayed in their earliest reporting. Those same outlets have quietly gone back and edited those descriptions in recent hours, swapping them for softer, more neutral language. Our newsroom believes viewers deserve to know that revision happened because it's easier to rewrite a headline than to admit the original one was simply wrong. This next story has taken an unexpected turn tonight, and it's one of the more damaging developments for anyone who spent years dismissing this narrative outright. For a long time, the dominant story was simple. You weren't a threat. Not sharp enough, not driven enough, not built for whatever room people assumed you were trying to enter. That story spread easily because it was convenient, and convenient stories rarely get fact-checked before they spread. Tonight, that convenience is catching up with the people who repeated it. New information confirms that every dismissal, every offhand comment about your limits, functioned less like an insult and more like an accidental leak of information about where attention wasn't being paid. When someone tells you, confidently, that you're not worth watching, they're also telling you exactly where their guard is down. That's not a small detail. That's a full blind spot, handed over voluntarily, by people too certain of their own judgment to double-check it. Our analysts describe this as one of the most common mistakes in stories like this one. People confuse quiet with harmless. They assume that if someone isn't performing their ambition loudly, the ambition doesn't exist. But the record now shows that some of the most significant growth in this entire story happened specifically because nobody was watching closely enough to interfere with it. That's not an accident either. That's what happens when underestimation becomes a cover. There's one more layer to this update that our fact-checkers insisted on including before we move on. Underestimation like this rarely comes from a place of genuine confidence. More often, according to behavioral analysts we consulted, it comes from insecurity wearing the mask of authority. People who are secure in their own position don't usually need to loudly dismiss someone else's potential. They simply observe, adjust, and move on. The fact that dismissal was repeated so often, so publicly, over such a long stretch of time, suggests something closer to preemptive defense than confident assessment. That's the part of tonight's update that critics are least likely to want circulated. We need to pause here for a correction, because our newsroom just received information that changes how the previous update should be understood. It turns out several of the loudest early critics in this story have quietly reached out to representatives close to tonight's subject. Not publicly, not on the record, but privately, in the hours since this story broke. Sources describe the tone of these messages as unusually warm, almost celebratory, a stark contrast to years of public commentary that suggested the opposite. Our team wants to be careful here, because private outreach after public dismissal isn't necessarily insincere. But it is, at minimum, worth noting as part of tonight's full and accurate record. We're now getting reports addressing one of the more persistent rumors in this entire story, the claim that inconsistency across different settings proves dishonesty. Let's be precise about what the evidence actually shows here, because this is where a lot of the original reporting got it wrong. Different rooms saw different versions, that part is true. But different versions are not the same thing as different truths. What changed from setting to setting wasn't the core of the story. It was how much of that core each audience had actually earned access to. Think about how information works in any serious investigation. Not every source gets the same level of access. Not every room is read in on the complete picture, and that's not deception, that's protocol. Applying that same standard here, what looked like inconsistency was closer to compartmentalization, a deliberate decision about how much depth a given audience was ready to receive without misusing it. Our sources point to something important in this update. Several relationships built during this story existed almost entirely on a single, narrow version of events. When more of the full picture became public, those relationships struggled, not because the truth changed anything real, but because the relationship itself was never built on anything more than a fragment to begin with. That's not a loss anyone reporting on this story should treat as a tragedy. It's simply what happens when a limited view meets a fuller one. The connections built only on the fragment don't survive contact with the whole, and that was always going to be the case eventually. The correction for the record tonight is simple. This was never a story about a person hiding behind multiple faces. It was a story about a person deciding, room by room, how much of the truth that particular room had actually demonstrated it deserved. We're getting live reactions now, and the mood, according to multiple accounts, has shifted noticeably since this story broke. People who used to occupy a certain position relative to this story are reporting a strange, unfamiliar discomfort. Nothing about the actual facts changed overnight. What changed is that the facts are finally being reported accurately, and that alone has been enough to rearrange how people are positioning themselves. Our correspondents describe it as a kind of live recalibration, happening in real time, without anyone officially announcing that anything has changed. Here's an important detail our newsroom wants to clarify, because some outlets are getting this part wrong. Nobody involved in this story asked for a new position, a new title, or a new level of respect. The shift in the room wasn't requested. It was automatic, the same way any accurate measurement corrects itself the moment real information is finally applied. Once the truth stopped being distorted, the room adjusted on its own, without needing anyone's permission to do so. There's a second angle developing in this update worth reporting carefully. Several individuals reacting the strongest to this shift are, according to sources, the ones who benefited the most from the previous, inaccurate version of events. The discomfort isn't really about the story at all. It's about the uncomfortable recalculation they now have to do about their own position, once the person they were quietly measuring themselves against stops holding still for comparison. That recalculation is happening live, on this broadcast, whether they're ready for the cameras or not. If you're still tracking this story with us, drop a satellite antenna in the comments right now, because our next update covers something even bigger than what's already been reported. There's a final detail in this update our field team insisted on including before we move on. Some of the people most visibly unsettled by this shift aren't rivals or critics at all. They're people who genuinely cared, in their own limited way, but who built that care around a version of the story that no longer holds up. Watching someone outgrow the frame you built for them is disorienting even when your intentions were never malicious. Our newsroom isn't reporting this to condemn those individuals. We're reporting it because accuracy matters, and pretending every uncomfortable reaction is hostile would be its own kind of distortion. A breaking update just came into the newsroom, and it's an important one. According to multiple sources close to the situation, everything reported so far tonight is only a portion of the full record. There are sections of this story that remain sealed, undisclosed, and according to our sources, likely to remain that way for the foreseeable future. That's not a gap in our reporting. That's a deliberate choice made by the subject of this broadcast, and frankly, it's the right one. A story with nothing left undisclosed has nothing left to surprise anyone with. But a story with confirmed sealed sections keeps every observer slightly off balance, unable to fully calculate what comes next. Our analysts want to be clear about something here, because it's easy to misread. Sealed information isn't the same as hidden wrongdoing. Nobody reporting on this story has uncovered anything that needs to come to light for the public's protection. What remains undisclosed is simply undisclosed by design, kept back not out of guilt, but out of strategy. And that strategy is working exactly as intended, because the uncertainty around what's still sealed is generating more attention than full disclosure ever could. The update for tonight's viewers is simple. Do not expect full access. It was never promised, and it isn't owed. What you've seen so far is real, verified, and significant. But treating it as the complete picture would be a mistake, and our sources suggest the most important developments in this story may still be ahead of us, not behind. Our newsroom also wants to address a question flooding in from viewers tonight. Several people are asking why the sealed sections weren't released alongside everything else, given how much has already come out. The honest answer, according to our sources, is timing and protection. Releasing everything at once doesn't just remove mystery, it removes leverage, and it exposes every remaining vulnerability to an audience that hasn't earned the right to see it yet. Strategic disclosure isn't evasive. It's simply how anyone protects what still matters while allowing the rest of the record to stand on its own. We're closing out tonight's coverage with an aftermath report, because how people respond after a story like this breaks often reveals more than the story itself. The first pattern our team identified is a sudden wave of renewed contact from people who had been distant or completely silent for extended periods. They're resurfacing now with comments, messages, and gestures of support that are, according to multiple sources, suspiciously well-timed. Our analysts caution viewers not to mistake this for genuine loyalty. Genuine support doesn't usually wait for a story to be safely confirmed before showing up. What's arriving now looks more like an attempt to establish proximity to an outcome after the risk of being associated with it has already disappeared. The second pattern is quieter, but our sources say it's just as telling. A number of people connected to this story have said absolutely nothing publicly since it broke. No comment, no reaction, nothing on the record. Our correspondents describe this silence as far from neutral. It's being interpreted, credibly, as evidence of private reckoning, individuals replaying their own past comments and behavior, quietly hoping none of it gets traced back to them on air. And the third pattern, perhaps the most predictable of tonight's report, involves a handful of individuals attempting to revise their own history in real time. Sudden claims of always having believed in this story, always having seen it coming, always having supported it from the beginning. Our fact-checkers find these claims difficult to verify, largely because the original record shows the opposite. Belief that only becomes public once believing is safe isn't really belief. It's timing, dressed up to look like loyalty after the fact. None of these reactions require a response from the subject of tonight's story. The aftermath doesn't change the reporting. It only confirms how accurate that reporting really was. There's a final note our correspondents wanted included in this segment. A small number of people connected to this story have reached out privately, not to claim credit or reposition themselves, but simply to express genuine relief that the accurate version of events is finally public. Our newsroom believes those individuals deserve to be distinguished from the rest of tonight's aftermath coverage. Not everyone reacting to this story is doing so out of guilt or opportunism. Some, quietly and without fanfare, were simply glad the truth caught up to where they already stood. Our newsroom has just received a short statement, and we're reading it in full because viewers deserve to hear it directly rather than through second-hand reporting. The statement reads as follows. To everyone reporting on this story tonight, thank you for finally getting the details right. To everyone who spent years reporting it wrong, this isn't about proving you incorrect for the sake of it. It's about no longer needing your version of events to determine what's true. The record now reflects reality. What each of you chooses to do with that is no longer part of this story. Our analysts note that statements like this are rare in developing stories of this size, precisely because most subjects feel pressure to say more, to explain further, to soften the correction for the people who got it wrong. Tonight's subject did the opposite, and according to our sources, that restraint is exactly consistent with everything else this story has shown us. No excess. No performance. Just the facts, delivered once, correctly, and left to stand on their own. That's where we leave tonight's developing story, though our sources suggest this is far from the final update. Here's the summary as it stands right now. The silence was never emptiness, it was control. The timing was never delayed, it was precision. The dismissal was never an accurate read, it was a blind spot handed over for free. The different versions people saw were never dishonesty, they were discretion. The shifting room was never anyone's demand, it was simple, automatic recalibration. And what's still sealed is not evidence of anything hidden that needs exposing. It's simply not owed to anyone yet. Every major claim reported about this story over the past several years has now been corrected, live, on the record, in front of the very audience that spread the original version. That correction didn't require anyone's permission, and it doesn't require anyone's apology to stand as accurate, though several people connected to this story owe one they are, according to our sources, unlikely to ever deliver. If tonight's coverage hit differently for you, let us know which update landed hardest. 1 through 7. Drop the number in the comments before you go, because this newsroom is going to keep reporting on exactly where this story goes next. This has been your breaking coverage. Story developing. Stay tuned.